Jake Ludington here at HP Discover, and I'm here with Paul Muller. And we've been talking a little bit about bimodal IT. Can you unpack what that is?
Bimodal IT or ambidextrous IT, I've heard two-speed IT. It's really a recognition, it's actually, let me start again, I think it's a response to a tension that's existed, I think, in the market now for the last 3 or 4 years as we start to talk about this new style of business, new style of IT. I found companies are kind of talking to me and saying, oh, you know, all of this cool stuff you're talking about, high rates of change, high velocity innovation, that's all great if you're, you know, one of the big born in the web companies. You know, we can run through the usual list of names. They're all clean sheet startups, but I've got, you know, 20, 50, 70 years of legacy. I'm highly regulated. You know, you're talking about these bright, shiny unicorns of technology. I'm a horse, and I don't feel like this stuff fits with me. And so, the kind of the discussion had become quite polarized. We were either one or the other. And I think, you know, as I call it ambidextrous IT sometimes, because it's really about recognizing that you're both left and right-handed, right? You're both great at running core mission-critical infrastructure that got you to where you are today, but you've also developed a capacity for structured innovation, structured risk-taking, and you're able to do both and actually shift between the two of them seamlessly.
So how does somebody go about doing that?
All right, well, if you turn to page number 3 in the manual, yeah, that's a good question, and there's a lot of, I'd say this is an area that's really developing, and all of us are learning a lot at the moment. I think first things first is understanding and unpacking what is core to the organisation, and where the areas for innovation are. And that's a really iterative and recursive process, because as you and I were discussing earlier, what's core to an organisation today could be disrupted tomorrow. So you need to be applying the lens of core versus disruptive or differentiating to everything that you do. But
so then in that case, innovative doesn't necessarily have to mean you're going out and building a new product in addition to the products that are already in your portfolio. It could be innovating around something currently in your infrastructure or in your product portfolio. Or
yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the classic one right now is you know, CPU server capacity, right? So servers have been around for, gosh, you know, half a century more. There's been a tremendous amount of innovation in that space, and one of the challenges that we see with organisations that are almost too resistant to change around the core is that they keep on looking at those servers in the data centre the same way they have for the last half a century, and we've seen. But if you think about it critically, we've seen virtualization technology, hypervisor technology, we've seen cloud technology, and now we've seen container technology continuously disrupt that space. And I'd argue if you look at technology like the machine as an example, you know, incredibly flat architectures, there'll be yet another wave of disruption we'll see, and it won't be the last. The challenge if you're in the core is recognizing that, and is understanding that core does not equal dull. There is a certain profile to core. It should have a relatively low scrappage rate. In other words, the level of waste of that system should be low. The cost efficiencies are expected to be high, and the reliability and predictability is also expected to be very high. But it doesn't mean that it's dull, and I think that's one of the big things we need to overcome, because you can imagine if you're an IT person, you're told, okay, I want you to work on the innovative side of the house, the fluid IT side of the house, and you're running core services. You can imagine a whole bunch of people becoming quite disenchanted if they associate core with unchanging.
I think that's the challenge everybody runs into once a product ships, right? Is do you go into the sustainability team, or do you get to go on the team that's working on the next version?
Absolutely. In fact, there's an interesting, there's a book that's just been published by some folks at Boston Consulting that look at strategy, and one of the things, it's funnily enough how business is actually having the same challenge that IT is, and I suppose it's because the two are now so closely related, is, you know, there was always this perception of you needed to pick a strategy. And the advice of this Boston Consulting, these authors, was you need to pick multiple. It's and. How do I go with cost efficiency and innovation and differentiation? How do I go with partnering and go solo play? And you need to be thinking about both. And the challenge that is, I think, the hard part of this challenge, that's the easy bit. Picking multiple strategies is easy, right? How do I get that to culturally fit within the organisation without getting this sort of massive organ rejection syndrome is the hard part.
So how do you, what is some advice that you give people for how to adapt to that?
Well, so it is a bit related to I guess the concepts of organisational change management. I think the first is helping people understand the reason why we need to change. And the big reason, as we talked about, is that disruption can come from anywhere. We need to be thinking about disrupting ourselves. You know, we've had the taxi industry, right, massively disrupted. It had been the same way for the last, I imagine, 100, 200 years, and then suddenly this set of companies have come in and completely reimagined ride sharing, car sharing, by applying technology in a disruptive way. We've seen the record industry disrupted, and then we've seen the disruptors be disrupted, right? So that process is happening continuously. So the first is helping people understand why it is that you need to do both. And then the second is, I think, and this is the harder part, is finding the right profile of people for both. There are some people who are really well suited to running relatively low rate of change environments. They're actually stressed by ambiguity and risk. And there are others who embrace risk and change and thrive in a slightly chaotic environment. So part of it's also just making sure you've got the right people in the right groups.
That is, once again, as we said in the previous interview that we did, people are always kind of that big challenge.
Yeah, it's such a hard part. The other element as well is, we've talked a little bit about this, and I'd love to know your experience in terms of running technology projects, but being able to be disciplined about how much change takes place. Because again, I think I'm sure you've seen these projects where people say, oh, we're going to replace this core system in this massive upgrade process. It's going to be a mega project, and you find these crazy numbers with 20, 30, 40, $50 million worth of change built into the system. And what happens is, of course, the expectations are high, the delivery dates get longer and longer. And by the time you figure out that the project doesn't work, it's too late to do anything about it, and you go back to running your old legacy systems. And so I think part of it as well is helping you, is maybe giving out what I'd call innovation or change tokens. So, if you want to run a project, you've got to use 70% core established infrastructure and services, and I'm going to give you 3 tokens. 30% of your architectural budget will be given over to trying some new components or technology. I don't know if you've seen any other approaches work.
So I've seen a lot of approaches that don't work. One key example is, the example that you kind of laid out, where you create a big project and you're gonna replace essentially everything.
Yeah.
And then you find out that all of the pieces that you thought were going to work together when you went to replace everything don't actually play nice. Mm-hmm. And unpacking which ones are actually the pieces that are broken is so much harder than just falling back to the original system, that you end up stuck in the legacy system, not because you didn't actually build some of the pieces that would work, but because you don't know which pieces work.
That's a really good point. And I think what happens then is your sponsor gets gun shy about changing that system ever again, and they associate the failure of overreach with an inability to get off the legacy system, and you start to see people hugging that legacy and saying, well, we can't change our core system anymore because we tried once before and it failed. And I think you've got you make such a really good point, which is, how do you innovate around the edge of it? And you will. It's a bit like your father's axe, right? It's had 3 heads and 2 handles, but it's been in the family for the last 70 years, right? And I think we've got to maybe look at the approach where we do innovate components at a time. I think it's a really good observation.
And I think one of the keys there is that this idea that you talk about, where everybody needs to think more like a product manager.
Yep.
I think there is the opportunity for individuals who are intricately aware of how the systems work together to pick apart which are the pieces that could be changed, improved upon for the biggest wins, so that you make this, here's a change that we can make, and it's going to give us this much improvement, and let's forget about all those other changes for a while and see if this actually works.
I think you hit the nail on the head. Gary Groover, who's actually here at HP Discover, talks about the idea of increasing modularity and decoupling systems to help accelerate that change. And I think some of the smartest stuff you can do is actually put wrappers around your legacy systems to make them feel and act to your developers and your operations people like modern systems, even though they might not necessarily have all of the attributes of that modern system. So that's a way that you can start to emulate and synthesize that process. And the other just is recognizing that legacy doesn't equal dull. Infrastructure services can be innovated. Service management is being completely changed with multi-supplier management, and encouraging people who are running core to, as you say, think like product managers, to look at opportunities to innovate and come up with new ideas.